Hi folks, welcome to Some of Each, episode 8, Sirens and Merfolk. So this is Some of Each, in which I read to you some fiction, some poetry, and some children's lit on a theme. So it's Sirens and Merfolk tonight, and I apologize in advance that the mirror feature on Facebook for some reason is not working for me, so all my book titles are going to be backwards, so I'll just explain them to you. So I'm going to start by reading to you from Alice Hoffman's The Museum of Extraordinary Things. At least you can still see the beautiful picture. So this novel is about Coralie Sardie, who is the daughter of, her father runs a freak show on Coney Island called the Museum of Extraordinary Things, and it's about her relationship with a photographer, this Russian immigrant photographer who's left his Orthodox community and just happens to photograph the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit about from the very beginning, in which Coralie is in training. Basically, she's the mermaid in her father's show. So March 1911. If Coralie Sardie had lived another life, in another time and place, she might have become a champion swimmer, a lauded athlete with garlands crowning her head, surrounded by crowds who pleaded for her autograph after she crossed the channel from England to France or circled Manhattan Island. Instead, she swam in the Hudson as dusk crossed the horizon, making certain to keep to the shadows. If she were a fish, she would have been an eel, a dark flash secreted within the even darker water, a lone creature set on a journey northward, unable to stop or rest until her destination had been reached. On this raw night, she stepped out of the river when she could swim no more, shaking from exertion. The relay swimming title had just been granted to a fellow from the New York Athletic Club who'd been dubbed the Human Fish, but Coralie could have beat his time with ease. She climbed onto a deserted bank under a sky swirling with stars and stood ankle-deep in the mud. She wrung out her hair, a smile playing at her blue lips. This had been her longest swim thus far. She'd lasted 90 minutes in the frigid river, a personal record. A wind had picked up and the weather was raw. Few swimmers would have been able to tolerate the cold, rushing water. All the same, Coralie was no champion. She had no clock and no admirers. She wore men's clothes, which made her movements easier. Fitted trousers and a white shirt tucked into her waistband. Before dressing, she coated her limbs with bear grease mixed with digitalis, a concoction meant to act as a stimulant and keep her warm. Still, despite this elixir and her training to withstand inhuman circumstances, she shuddered with the cold. As she forged her way through a tangle of reeds, Coralie realized the rising spring tide had carried her off course. She was much farther north than she'd anticipated and had arrived in the no-man's land of Upper Manhattan, where the Dutch had once farmed enormous tracts in the wetlands. Not far to the east, there were still small villages along the Harlem River, inhabited by communities of Black Americans and Irish immigrants, who had settled on that river's sandy coves, their houses hidden from view by enormous beech and tulip trees that were more than 300 years old. Unlike most rivers, the current in the Hudson ran in two directions, pushed north by the Atlantic Ocean, turning into rivulets and streams and meeting with the Harlem River before the combined waterways receded south to the harbor. After a winter of heavy squalls and snowfalls, the Hudson was moving much faster than expected. Coralie's father's calculations had therefore proved wrong. The professor was waiting nearly 3 miles to the south, alongside the liveryman in his carriage, ready to greet Coralie with a wool blanket and the flask of whiskey he vowed would keep her from catching a chill in her lungs. After 8 years of performances, Coralie's fame had waned. The public's hunger was for curiosities that had never been seen before, not for creatures they'd become accustomed to. Barnum and Bailey's circus was opening in Madison Square Garden. It was the same location where Barnum had first exhibited his spectacles when the area was occupied by the great Roman hippodrome, an arena without a roof or heat. People were entranced by the prancing steeds, the spectacle and wonder of acrobats and trained seals, the thundering Roman chariot race that drove dust into the air. Barnum had begun his career with a museum in Lower Manhattan, showing off taxidermy and fossils, along with questionable exhibits such as the Fiji mermaid, a monkey's torso with a fish tail attached. It was that swindler Barnum who Professor Sardis wished to surpass, for he felt himself to be a true man of science, whereas Barnum was nothing more than a charlatan. Yet Barnum was an American hero, and the professor's fortunes were failing. Coralie had been a star attraction as a child in Coney Island, but she was a child no more. The tail she wore was made of thin strips of bamboo that were flexible, covered by silk that had been treated with paraffin and copper sulfate so they would be waterproof. The breathing tube attached to the side of the tank could not be seen by onlookers. When she turned to flash her blue tail, she gulped in air from the tube. Her father suspected that the crowds had caught on to their tricks and asked that she use the tube as infrequently as possible. Her childhood training of remaining underwater in a tub had increased her breathing capacity far beyond the abilities of a normal woman. Sometimes she felt she barely needed air. At night, she slipped into the tub in the washroom for comfort, settling beneath the warm, soapy water, a balm to her cold flesh and pale hands, which were dipped into blue dye every morning. Between her fingers there was a birth defect, a thin webbing that the indigo tint emphasized. This was the reason she wore gloves in public, though her abnormality rarely hindered her in practical matters. Still, she despised herself because of this single flaw. She had often imagined taking a pair of scissors to her flesh so she might snip through the pale skin. The one time she'd attempted to rid herself of the webbing with a sharp knife used for coring apples, beads of blood began to fall into her lap after she nicked the first bit of skin. Each drop was so brightly crimson she had startled and quickly dropped the knife. Even when the crowds faded, there were still a handful of faithful admirers who continued to gather beside Coralie's tank, men whose sexual interest was evident in every fevered glance. No man had ever possessed her, although several had offered the professor extravagant sums in exchange for her virginity, one going so far as to include a proposal of marriage. All advances were denied with an edge of fury from her father. Coralie was certain these same suitors would have not even glanced at her in daily life, when she was nothing more than her father's pale, ungainly daughter dressed in black, stopping at the market stalls on Neptune Avenue to choose turnips and spinach and fish. The men who were her greatest admirers were looking for the depraved and wicked thrill of possessing a freak of nature. They would be shocked to discover how ordinary she was, for her greatest pleasure was to read one of the novels she found in her father's library, or to sit with Maureen on the back steps to plan a spring garden. She was no man's dark dream, only a girl forced to swim half-clothed. This past January, when Coney Island had been dotted with snow and the waves in the murky Atlantic had kept even the most experienced fishermen at home, Coralie had entered the museum to discover that her tank was no longer in the center of the exhibition hall. It had been lifted onto rollers by the liverymen and hauled to a corner, then covered with a tarp. Coralie had always imagined she would be grateful to be released from her obligations, but suddenly she was nothing, not even a fictitious mermaid. Who was she then? A quiet girl no one noticed, invisible to most men's eyes. She realized that she had formed an attachment to her false persona, for a mermaid was a one-of-a-kind creature that commanded attention, whereas she was nothing of any worth. Her father, however, was a man of the future. He had no difficulty moving on. He was quick to dismiss employees who no longer drew a crowd. Tears and pleading were insufficient once a curiosity was of no further interest to the paying public. Many of the living wonders Coralie had known since childhood had been let go as soon as their popularity began to diminish, never to be spoken of again. The woman covered by bees had refused to change her act to include wasps, for their stings could be deadly. After a heated conversation with the professor, she was forced to go. Her employer would not even allow her the time to collect her hive of bees, which were left in the garden in a wooden box. Later in the season, when Coralie tried to set them free, it did no good. The bees huddled together in the only home they had known, where they sickened as the weather grew raw and soon enough died. There were other wonders who disappeared without a goodbye. The crowds quickly tired of the goat boy with hooves instead of feet, and the bird woman who dressed all in feathers and could only whistle any song, from an oriole's trill to a magpie's fierce cry. The tiny lady, who could fit into a set of child's clothes, Marie de Montague, alternately drank from a baby's bottle, filled not with milk but with weak red rose Ceylon tea laced with gin, and smoked a cigar. But she was soon viewed as old hat, for there were wonders many inches smaller than she. In the end, she was employed by a second-rate theater on Neptune Avenue, where the raucous crowd called out insulting names, tossing pennies at her as they urged her to show her small bottom or breasts, which she was known to do on wicked nights when there were no ladies in attendance. If Coralie had been anyone else, a hired act like any other, she would have already been turned out of her father's house. She wondered if she might have preferred a life as a housemaid or as a clerk in a nearby shop, but her father drew her close and told her he would never let her go. What we do not have, we will create, he assured her. It had already fashioned his clever plan. The new creature might be an alligator or a snake or some strange combination of the two, wrought by thread and nails and ingenuity, a being far superior to Barnum's Fiji mermaid. There was a workshop in the cellar, a space Coralie had never been allowed to enter, not even after she'd passed the age of 10. 2 locks bolted upon the door, one made of iron, the other of brass. The keys were kept on the professor's watch chain. Our creature will be whatever people imagine it will be, he confided to Coralie. For what men believe in, they will pay to see. So that's from Alice Hoffman's Museum of Extraordinary Things, which is, in fact, an extraordinary book. All right, so some poetry. I've got several mermaid poems for you. I'm going to read to you first from this poet, Irish poet, Nuala Dhomhnaill, and this is from her selected poems. And this one is just called The Mermaid. Ebb tide, I said. The tide will have to turn and cover this waste of sand, pour over limpets on rocks, over wrack, drying waterless, ribbons like withered vellum, because the lugworms' faces make me nauseous. Flood tide, ebb tide. Flood tide, ebb tide. Rise and fall, the same again. Everything's so bad now it can't get worse, but we have ways of making you talk, I hear in Gestapo accents. Water goes down and down, but no tide nears me. Though I've got a fish's tail, I'm not unbeautiful. My hair is long and yellow, and there's a shine from my scales you won't see on landlocked women. Their eyes are like the stones, but look into these eyes of mine, and you will see the sturgeon, and you will see fine seals gamboling in my pupils. Not without pain have I landed. I broke the natural law. I swapped swimming for walking on earth, picking my steps like a curlew. Believe you me, it was love, not God, who gave the order. You left and took my magic cap. It's not as easy to get back in the roof's rafters as it was in the fable. I dug to the subsoil and saw no sign of it. The tide also fails us, and a rat gnaws at the very sun. That's The Mermaid by Nuala Dhomhnaill. And I'm actually going to read you one other of hers. This one's called The Mermaid in the Hospital. I wish I could read the Irish to you. I did take Irish for a short amount of time, but nowhere's near enough to read the poems to you in Irish. So, The Mermaid in the Hospital. She awoke to find her fishtail clean gone, but in the bed with her were 2 long, cold thingamies. You'd have thought they were tangles of kelp or collops of ham. They're no doubt taking the piss, it being New Year's Eve, half the staff legless with drink and the other half playing pranks. Still, this is taking it a bit far. And with that, she hurled the 2 thingamies out of the room. But here's the thing she still doesn't get. Why she tumbled out after them, arse over tip, how she was connected to those 2 thingamies and how they were connected to her. It was the sister who gave her the wink and let her know what was what. You have 1 leg attached to you there and another one under that. 1 leg, 2 legs, a 1 and a 2. Now you have to learn what they can do. In the long months that followed, I wonder if her heart fell, the way her arches fell, her instep arches. So that's The Mermaid in the Hospital by Nuala Dhomhnaill. And next, I'm going to read you this poem by Caitríona O'Reilly, another Irish poet. And this one, it's a section from the Sea Cabinet, and this is part 2 called The Mermaid. The Mermaid. Between the imaginary iceberg and the skeletal whale is the stuffed and mounted mermaid in her case, the crudely stitched seam between skin and scale, so unlike Herbert Draper's siren dreams, loose on the swelling tide, part virgin and part harpy. Her post-mortem hair and her terrible face look more like P.T. Barnum's Freak of Fiji, piscine and wordless, trapped in the net of a stare. She has the head and shriveled tits of a monkey, the green glass eyes of a porcelain doll, a pair of praying mantis hands, and fishy lips, open to reveal her sea-caved mouth, her rare ivory mermaid teeth. Children breathe and rap on the glass to make her move. In her fixity, she's as far as can be from the Selkie, who slips her wet pelt on the beaches of Orkney and walks as a woman, pupils widened in light, discarding the stuffed sack of her body. Without hearing or touch or taste or smell or sight, she echoes the numb roll of the whale in a sea congealed with cold, when it was thought no beast could be as nerveless as the whale. So that's The Mermaid from the Sea Cabinet by Caitríona O'Reilly. Next up, also called The Mermaid, this is from Lisel Mueller. All day, he had felt her stirring under the boat, and several times, when the net had tightened, frog nervous, he had bungled the pulling in, half glad of the stupid open mouths he could throw back. At sundown, the shifting and holding of time and air had brought her to the still surface, to sun herself in the last slow light where lilies and leeches tangled and rocked. He could have taken her then, aimed his net as dragonfly hunters do when the glassy gliding of rainbows goes to their heads. Could have carried her home on tiptoe and lifted her lightly, ever so lightly, over his sill. And, hopeless, knew that to have her alive was only this, the sounding, casting, waiting, seeing, and praying the light not to move, not yet to round the bay of her shoulder and passing release her to the darkness he would not enter. It's The Mermaid by Lisel Mueller. And this one, I love this one. This is a little surreal, people, so get ready. This is called The Inside Out Mermaid. This is by Matthea Harvey, and it's from If the Tabloids Are True, What Are You? So The Inside Out Mermaid. The inside-out mermaid is fine with letting it all hang out. Veins, muscles, the bits of fat at her belly, her small gray spleen. At first, her lover loves it. With her organs on the outside, she's the ultimate open book. He can pump her lungs like two bellows and make her gasp, ask her difficult questions, and study the synapses firing in her brain as she answers to see if she's lying. Poke a pleasure center in the frontal lobe and watch her squirm. No need for bouquets or sad stories about his childhood. He just plucks a pulmonary vein and watches the left ventricle flounder. But before long, she starts to sense that her lover, like all the others before him, is getting restless. This is when she starts showing them her collections. The basket of keys from all over the world, the box of zippers with teeth of every imaginable size, all chosen to convey a sense of openness. As a last resort, she'll even read out loud the entries from her diary about him to him. But eventually, he'll become convinced she's hiding things from him, and she is. Her perfect skin, her long black hair, her red mouth, never chapped from exposure to sun or wind, how she secretly loves that he can't touch her here or here. So that's The Inside Out Mermaid by Matthea Harvey. All right, next I'm going to read to you from this book, Bestiary by Donika Kelly. This has a bunch of wonderful, fantastical things inside of it. And it's also got throughout it these love poems to fantastical beasts and creatures. So this one is called Love Poem Mermaid. Do you ever look into a mirror, which is also an ocean heavy with sun? Do you ever pull your hair wet over your shoulder to dry as you sit and sing for another's death? Love, I am made for calling, bare breast, smooth tail, the perfect balance of scales. I have claimed this rock, which is also your heart, which is also a shell I hold to my ear to hear what is right in front of me. I am a witness to the sea and the sun, to your body lashed to the mast. Oh, that my voice were a knife, that a knife could change anything, that there was nothing between us but salt and breath. It's Love Poem Mermaid from Donika Kelly from Bestiary. So I'm going to read you just one of mine here. This is from my daughter's manuscript that's coming out from Early Press next year. And this is where we get into the Sirens territory of the Sirens and Merfolk theme tonight. So this is Siren's daughter. Our songs are not for you. My mother didn't teach me to lilt a lyric from my throat, to crest a note from my tongue in order to enthrall or summon a man. Such conceit, to think a goddess would sing of men's deeds. We sing for the same reason cranes sing, or the deepening whales, or a whole fierce chorus of wolves. I wish all of you would bind your rough and yearning bodies to the masts of your figure-headed ships, sails all abeat in the salty wind, breaking the waves. Because truth be told, I've had enough of you and your maddening inability to keep your hearts and hands to yourselves. Your excuses puddle round your boots. But still you come. My mother says men cannot leave a thing of beauty to unfurl of its own accord. You must always lean in and pluck it, roots and all, no matter the withering. So we've had to make our homes among the sharpest rocks. We have to pick the roughest whorl of seas. And if we draw your ships to smithereens, well, that will not stop us from singing. So that's Siren's Daughter from Daughters, which will be out next year from Early Press. So a little bit of children's lit now. I'm going to read you a couple of short things. First, this collection by Jane Yolen, who's one of my favorite children's book authors. She does poetry and illustrated books and all sorts of other wonderful things. This is Neptune Rising, which is a collection of songs and tales of the undersea folk by Jane Yolen. And I'm just going to read you a short piece called The Lady and the Merman. Got a merman in with the merfolk too, not just mermaids. There's your picture. All right, The Lady and the Merman. Once, in a house overlooking the cold northern sea, a baby was born. She was so plain, her father, a sea captain, remarked on it. She shall be a burden, he said. She shall be on our hands forever. Then, without another glance at the child, he sailed off on his great ship. His wife, who had longed to please him, was so hurt by his complaint that she soon died of it. Between one voyage and the next, she was gone. When the captain came home and found this out, he was so enraged he never spoke of his wife again. In this way, he convinced himself that her loss was nothing. But the girl lived and grew as if to spite her father. She looked little like her dead mother, but instead had the captain's face set round with mouse-brown curls. Yet as plain as her face was, her heart was not. She loved her father, but was not loved in return. And still the captain remarked on her looks. He said at every meeting, God must have wanted me cursed to give me such a child. No one will have her. She shall never be wed. She shall be with me forever. So he called her Born, for she was his burden. Born grew into a lady and only once gave a sign of this hurt. Father, she said one day when he was newly returned from the sea, what can I do to heal this wound between us? He looked away from her, for he could not bear to see his own face mocked in hers, and spoke to the cold stone floor. There is nothing between us, daughter, he said. But if there were, I should say, salt for such wounds. Salt? Born asked, surprised, for she knew the sting of it. A sailor's balm, he said. The salt of tears, or the salt of sweat, or the final salt of the sea. Then he turned from her and was gone next day to the farthest port he knew of, and in this way he cleansed his heart. After this, Born never spoke again of the hurt. Instead, she carried it silently like a dagger inside. For the salt of tears did not salve her, so she turned instead to work. She baked bread in her ovens for the poor, she nursed the sick, she held the hands of the sea widows, but always late in the evening she walked on the shore, looking and longing for a sight of her father's sail. Only less and less often did he return from the sea. One evening, tired from the work of the day, Born felt faint as she walked on the strand. Finding a rock, half in and half out of the water, she climbed upon it to rest. She spread her skirts about her, and in the dusk they lay like great gray waves. How long she sat there, still as the rock, she did not know. But a strange pale moon came up, and as it rose, so too rose the little creatures of the deep. They leaped free for a moment of the pool of the tide, and last of all, up from the depths, came the merman. He rose out of the crest of the waves, sea foam crowning his green-black hair. His hands were raised high above him, and the webbings of his fingers were as colorless as air. In the moonlight, he seemed to stand upon his tail. Then, with a flick of it, he was gone back to the deeps. He thought no one had remarked his dive. But Born had. So silent and still she saw it all, his beauty and his power. She saw him and loved him, though she loved the fish half of him more. It was all she could dare. She could not tell what she felt to a soul, for she had no one who cared about her feelings. Instead, she forsook her work and walked by the sea both morning and night. Yet strange to say, she never once looked for her father's sail. That is why her father returned one day without her knowing it. He watched her through slotted eyes as she paced the shore, for he would not look straight upon her. At last he went to her and said, "Be done with it. Whatever ails you, give it over," for even he could see this wound. Born looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with small seas. Grateful even for this attention, she answered, "Yes, father, you are right. I must be done with it." The captain turned and left her then, for his food was growing cold, but Born went directly to the place where the waves were creeping onto the shore. She called out in a low voice, come up and be my love." There was no answer except the shrieking laughter of the birds as they dove into the sea. She took a stick and wrote the same words upon the sand for the merman to see should he ever return. Only as she watched, the creeping tide erased her words one by one by one. Soon there was nothing left of her cry on that shining strand. So Born sat herself down on the rock to weep, and each tear was an ocean. But the words were not lost. Each syllable, washed from the beach, was carried below, down, down, down to the deeps of the cool, inviting sea, and there, below on his coral bed, the merman saw her words and came. He was all day swimming up to her. He was half the night seeking that particular strand, but when he came, cresting the currents, he surfaced with a mighty splash below Born's rock. The moon shone down on the two, and a grave shadow perched upon a stone, and he all motion and light. Born reached down with her white hands, and he caught them in his. It was the only touch she could remember. She smiled to see the webs stretched taut between his fingers. He laughed to see hers webless, thin and small. One great pull between him, and he was up by her side. Even in the dark, she could see his eyes on her under the phosphorescence of his hair. He sat all night by her, and Born loved the man of him as well as the fish then, for in the silent night it was all one. Then, before the sun could rise, she dropped her hands on his chest. "Can you love me?" she dared to ask. But the merman had no tongue to tell her above the waves. He could only speak below the water with his hands, a soft murmuration. So wordlessly he stared into her eyes and pointed to the sea. Then, with the sun just rising beyond the rim of the world, he turned, dove arrow-slim into a wave, and was gone. Gathering her skirts, now heavy with ocean spray and tears, Born stood up. She cast but one glance at the shore and her father's house beyond. Then she dove after the merman into the sea. The sea put bubble jewels in her hair and spread her skirts about her like a scallop shell. Tiny colored fish swam in between her fingers. The water cast her face in silver, and all the sea was reflected in her eyes. She was beautiful for the first time and for the last. So that's The Merman, or The Lady and the Merman, from Neptune Rising by Jane Yolen. And to complete our evening, There's no way I could get through Sirens and Merfolk without reading to you The Little Mermaid. And of course, this is the original by Hans Christian Andersen with all its death and darkness and turmoil, and not the, happy version that most of us know. Real deal here. The Little Mermaid. The Sea King had been a widower for many years, and his old mother kept house for him in the palace at the bottom of the sea. He had 6 beautiful daughters, and the youngest was the most beautiful of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose leaf, and her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like all the others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a tail, like a fish. At last she reached her 15th birthday, so she said farewell and rose as lightly as a bubble to the surface of the water. The sun had just set, and as she raised her head above the waves. The sea was calm and the air mild and fresh. A large ship with 3 masts lay becalmed on the water, with only 1 sail set, for not a breeze stirred, and the sailors sat idle on deck or amongst the rigging. There was music and song on board, and as darkness came on, 100 colored lanterns were lighted, as if the flags of all nations waved in the air. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin windows, and now and then, as the waves lifted her up, she could look in through the clear glass window panes and see a number of well-dressed people within. Among them was a young prince, the most beautiful of all, with large black eyes. He was 16 years of age, and his birthday was being kept with much rejoicing. The sailors were dancing on deck, but when the prince came out of the cabin, more than 100 rockets rose in the air, making it as bright as day. The little mermaid was so startled that she dived under the water, and when she again stretched out her head, it appeared as if all the stars of heaven were falling around her. She had never seen such fireworks before. After a while, the sails were quickly unfurled, and the noble ship continued her passage. But soon the waves rose higher, heavy clouds darkened the sky, and lightning appeared in the distance. The waves rose mountains high, as if they would have overtopped the mast. To the little mermaid this appeared pleasant sport, not so to the sailors. At length the ship groaned and creaked, the thick planks gave way under the lashing of the sea as it broke over the deck. The mainmast snapped asunder like a reed, the ship lay over her on her side, and the water rushed in. The mermaid now perceived that the crew were in danger. Even she herself was obliged to be careful to avoid the beams and planks of the wreck, which lay scattered on the water. At one moment it was so pitch dark that she could not see a single object, but a flash of lightning revealed the whole scene. She could see everyone who had been on board excepting the prince. When the ship parted, she had seen him sink into the deep waves, and she was glad, for she thought he would now be with her. But then she remembered that human beings could not live in the water, and that when he got down to her father's palace he would be quite dead. But he must not die. So she dived deeply under the dark waters, rising and falling with the waves, till at length she managed to reach the young prince. She held his head above the water and let the waves drift them where they would. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun rose up red and glowing from the water, and its beams brought back the hue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. Presently they came in sight of land. The sea here formed a little bay in which the water was quite still but very deep. So she swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine. The little mermaid swam out from the shore and placed herself between some high rocks that rose out of the water. Then she covered her head and neck with the foam of the sea so that her little face might not be seen, and watched to see what would become of the poor prince. She did not wait long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where he lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment. Then she fetched a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came to life again and smiled upon those who stood round him. But to her he sent no smile. He knew not that she had saved him. This made her unhappy, and when he was led away into the great building, she dived down sorrowfully into the water and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more so. "If human beings are not drowned," asked the mermaid, "can they live forever? Do they never die as we do here in the sea?" Yes, replied the old lady, they must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water, and we have not even a grave down here of those we love. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again. But like the green seaweed, when once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever after the body has been turned to dust. But if a man were to love you so much that you were more to him than his father or mother, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be true to you here and hereafter, then his soul would glide into your body, and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind. And then the little mermaid went out from her garden, and took the road to the foaming whirlpools beyond which the sorceress lived. I know what you want, said the sea witch. It is very stupid of you, but you shall have your way, and it will bring you sorrow, my pretty princess. I will prepare a draught for you, with which you must swim to land tomorrow before sunrise, and sit down on the shore and drink it. Your tail will then disappear and shrink up into what mankind call legs, and you will feel great pain, as if a sword were passing through you. But all who see you will say that you are the prettiest little human being they have ever seen. You will still have the same floating gracefulness of movement, and no dancer will ever tread so lightly. But at every step you take, it will feel as if you were treading upon sharp knives, and that the blood must flow, and you must give me your voice. It all happened as the witch said. The prince found her on the shore and took her to the palace. She was very soon arrayed in costly robes of silk and muslin, and was the most beautiful creature in the palace, but she was dumb, and could neither speak nor sing. Finally, the prince was going to be married to the princess of a neighboring country. When he arrived there in his ship, the church bells were ringing, and from the high towers sounded a flourish of trumpets, and soldiers with flying colors and glittering bayonets lined the roads through which they passed. The little mermaid kissed his hand and felt as if her heart were already broken. His wedding morning would bring death to her, and she would change into foam. After the wedding, they all went on board the ship to rest. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the edge of the vessel and looked towards the east for the first ray of the dawn, which was to be her death. She saw her sisters rising out of the flood. "We have given our hair to the witch," said they, "to obtain help for you, that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. Here it is. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again and form into a fish's tail, and you will be once more a mermaid." The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the couch, and beheld the fair bride with her head resting upon the prince's breast. She bent down and kissed his fair brow, then looked at the sky on which the rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter. Then she glanced at the knife, and again fixed her eyes on the prince. Then she threw the knife into the sea and plunged in herself. When she opened her eyes, she found herself surrounded by beautiful beings like angels. "Where am I?" asked she. "Among the daughters of the air," answered one of them. So that is the original true Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. So we had that tonight, as well as a story, The Lady and the Merman from Neptune Rising by Jane Yolen, poems by me, and by Matthea Harvey, and Donika Kelly, and Lisel Mueller, and Caitríona O'Reilly, Nuala, and here's Donika Kelly's Bestiary. And of course, we started with Alice Hoffman's The Museum of Extraordinary Things, all of which I recommend. So if you like what you heard tonight, please support your local independent bookstores and get your books online or curbside pickup from them. And I hope to see you next week. Good night, everyone.